Wow, well, we made it to the end, everyone. How you all feeling? Had a good time? Yeah? All right. Well, I didn't know what it would feel like batting cleanup here at Nordic API, so I'm glad you aren't running off to catch flights or anything like that, because today you get to hear about, you get to hear the guy who works for a company that has an SDK as a service tell you why you don't need SDKs. So this should be entertaining, at least I hope it is. So I do work for APIMatic, and we have a way for taking an API definition and generating code libraries and documentation and code samples and all that good stuff. So I want to start with the truth, though. And the truth is that developers don't need SDKs to integrate or to connect with your APIs. There, I've said it. In fact, I'd love to see a show of hands. How many people think that developers don't even want SDKs? Oh, there we go. Okay. And I wouldn't disagree with that opinion, because there are lots of developers. I don't want to categorize them as 10x developers, but they are experienced developers who've probably done a lot of work with APIs in the past. They've got their favorite toolkits. They don't want to adopt your SDK that you've created, and that's okay. I think that's fine. But there's another truth, which is, I think Daniel touched on this, about complexity. There are lots of different APIs. Their implementations vary, sometimes greatly. There's complexity in APIs, there's complexity in authentication, and there's a whole lot of developers out there who might appreciate having an SDK. So, Sid, you're telling us we don't need them, but we do need them. How do we kind of delve into this? I thought today I could share some personal stories from the companies that I've worked at who have APIs and who we have and have not built SDKs for. So the first company I want to tell you about is a niche SaaS company I worked with briefly, and they had these brand new APIs. They were super excited, and I joined, and I said, okay, cool, I'm going to go check out the dev portal, and this is an actual screenshot, and we got some code samples, and I'm like, this is great. Where are the SDKs? Oh, they don't have any. And I'm like, okay, I have an idea. But before I proposed building anything, I said, so this new API, who is this for? Oh, it's for our partners. And I thought, oh, great, you know, thousands of developers. I said, how many partners you have? Well, I don't know, we're targeting about a dozen. Oh, okay. Who else is going to use this API? And they said, well, our customers. I thought, okay, great. But wait, do your customers have any development resources, any staff, anybody on their team that are going to be able to use these APIs? Oh, no. They're more into the low-code, no-code sort of thing. And in that conversation, it became very clear that I didn't need to suggest building SDKs for them, because there just wasn't going to be an ROI for them. It would have been this huge technical investment and a long-term maintenance obligation that they would have taken on. And so in that case, I didn't. And so I think the point in sharing that story is that there are signals that we need to look for to help us make that decision, because it's not a black and white. It's not developers love them or developers hate them. It's, does your API and your use case and your audience and your context actually need them? So the biggest one, I think, is, are you still trying to prove the value of your APIs? If you're still at that stage, maybe rushing out and building SDKs in 6 different languages may or may not make sense. Again, there's no black or white here, but that's, I think, a pretty important one to get out of the way. I also think, like I mentioned, if you only plan to service a handful of developers, maybe your API isn't that complex. You know, you don't have a lot of endpoints. The data structures aren't that complex. I like this one. You don't have strong competitors. I was actually in a situation, I'll share that story in a minute, where we were far ahead of our competition, and we had a really good API and good documentation, and the competitors were still trying to catch up to us. So we didn't prioritize SDKs at that time. And then also like your target users. Maybe they're on either end of the spectrum. They're really experienced or they don't want to use SDKs because that's not really how they're going to use your API. But now we're going to say, well, hold on. So those are the signals why, but then you've got all these companies that actually are investing in SDKs. So maybe we should dive into some of the reasons why, because these are all well-respected brands and they've got big engineering teams and they've invested in them. But another proof point, just so we don't look at those logos and think, well, that company is in that vertical or that industry and only they're interested in offering SDKs or only their developers will use them. We looked at 100 API companies last year as part of some research, and they all had SDK programs, and we actually took a look at what industries they were in. This isn't to mean that payments and fintech have more SDKs. It just means that we just took a sample size, and these were all the industries. So don't draw any conclusions from that, other than SDKs are being provided in a lot of different industries out there. But before we go any further, I do want to clarify what I mean by a software development kit, because I think when I started in this world, I was very naive. I thought I really equated it with the library itself. I was npm install, that's the SDK, right? But in fact, it's more than just the code library. So when you start venturing into this world of building these SDKs, these code libraries initially, you also need to think about how you're going to build documentation to go along with it, a getting started guide that shows the developer how to actually configure and use your code libraries, code samples that demonstrate how to use each of the different endpoints. You might even go all the way to build use case guides, which show those workflows or those multi-step API calls where you want to demonstrate how do I solve this real business problem using a series of API calls. And lastly, something that I'm really in favor of is some kind of sample app where a developer can fork or clone and download the code, drop in their API keys, and start experiencing your API without having to do a lot of configuration in their own IDE. So when I say SDK, that's what I mean. I didn't always think that way, but that's sort of where my head is at today. And I think a big question we have to ask ourselves is, why do developers want SDKs, those ones I mentioned that would be interested in them? I think Stripe does a pretty good job of nailing one of the reasons, which is it reduces the amount of boilerplate code that developers have to write. And I didn't call Stripe to get this quote. This is actually straight from their developer documentation. So they're very upfront about why they're offering these to developers. But I've got some other reasons that I've come to believe the more I think about this topic. One is reducing complexity. If you're brand new to working with APIs and you've never done OAuth before, then just getting that access token and being able to authenticate can be a real challenge. And what a good SDK will do is it will actually put a nice, simple interface and take care of a lot of the complexity and hide it from the developer so they don't have to worry about how they're going to actually manage this flow, as well as making a token refresh before each API call to make sure that it's not expired. So those are some of the benefits. And then this is a personal favorite. I worked for Xero for many years. I love the company. I love the developer team and the platform. This is our documentation about how to use the Files API endpoint. And I was working on some SDKs for them, and I was like, how do I figure this out? And it was a huge amount of trial and error on my part because I had to get the headers just right. I had to get the body just right, and all the little pieces had to be there. And along the way, I would even get a 200 OK response back. I'd log into the web UI. I'd go to look at the JPEG I'd uploaded, and it was a broken image. I was like, OK, I'm getting closer. maybe. At least it's getting to the server. It's just scrambled somehow. Eventually, I solved it. Some languages were easier than others, depending on the HTTP client I was using and how easy it made it for me to actually get it to work. But what I felt in that moment when I solved some of these problems through building SDKs, I thought, wow, if thousands of developers use this, I've just saved them, I don't know how many hours, because I just spent several hours figuring this out. So that's one of the powers, I think, is reducing that complexity. Also, our APIs change, and I don't know, I think this is a good thing. Maybe people don't think this is a great thing, but developers, when you provide an SDK, don't see much difference between your API and your SDK. The SDK is a representation of your API in some way. So when you change your API, instead of the developers having to go to your change log and release notes and figure out what's changed in the API, they can simply use a popular package registry to get the latest version, or if they want to, they can choose not to upgrade to the latest version, but they can at least have it easier to understand that changes have occurred because they're so used to going to NPM as opposed to remembering to go back to your site and look for those release notes. And then lastly, developers, they love to achieve this state of flow. I'm sure if anyone in the room has coded before, it's that moment when you're just in the moment, you're just cranking out code, and the last thing you want to do is have to jump back to some API reference docs to look at what are the parameters I need to pass, what's the type of those parameters, or just to understand something in the way that the API has been implemented. So you get, with a good SDK and a good code library, you're getting hinting, you're getting code completion, even inline documentation, as Stripe demonstrates. So now another fun story. So I mentioned I worked at Xero, and I found an old blog post, and this is an actual slide from a presentation that we did at a conference for our developer community. And you'll see in 2011, we delivered SDKs. I'm a little embarrassed to say that is not the truth, because they weren't really SDKs. In fact, internally, we didn't call them that. We called them API wrappers. And the reason we called them that was because it was just a code library, right? It wasn't all those other things around it. And in fact, it was really just to help with the authentication, because we were on OAuth 1. You had to generate some public-private key pairs in some situations. We generated an SSL certificate, and you had to install that on your server so that we could validate that you were exactly who you say you were, and it was overkill. But it was killing the developers, and these wrappers were there to kind of ease some of that pain. So I decided, I should go in and explore these. I should, I should ask the question, let me be the developer in this situation. Let me actually go and look at the README. Let me try and use these. And it was difficult. And I said to my boss, I said, why don't we have full, official SDKs? And he said, our support ends at the endpoint. And I thought about that for a second. And I didn't really love that answer, but I said, okay, if that's the policy, I'll support that. But the reality was, it didn't end there, because there were headaches all around. I would talk to our support team, and over 50% of the inquiries were around that authentication that I talked about. Our forums had developers sharing code snippets with each other. How do you do this in PHP? And someone would post some code, and then someone would follow up and say, it didn't work for me. And we would jump in and try and help, because we were developer advocates, and that's what our mission was, to help the developers. And then our community started making their own API libraries, which we thought was great. So why not just put a link on our dev portal and say, go use these community libraries? And that worked for a little while, except there were some security changes. TLS 1.0 was being deprecated, which means you had to get on TLS 1.2, and That meant you had to change some configurations in your client as well as your server. And we started to really worry that when we went live with this, we were going to start breaking everyone's integration. So we reached out to these community maintainers and said, hey, can you fix this for us? And some were okay with it. By this tweet, you can see some were not. It definitely gave me pause about this strategy of basically outsourcing part of our developer experience to the community. And it really led me on this road to what can I do to try to make the experience better for our developers. But what really got me was when a large bank from Australia contacted us about our Java SDK. Can you tell us where that is? And it was worse than the API libraries, the API wrappers I was telling you about. It was just some code snippets that we would kind of pass out and put on the forums. And they were, what's the word? Not pleased. And I'll be honest, I was embarrassed because we were a growing SaaS company with a great API, I thought, and a great program. We really wanted we consider ourselves like really aspiring to be great. And I felt that this didn't look good. So I started down this journey of hand building that first Java SDK. But before I tell you that story, I guess I should tell you what the signals are that we need in the SDKs, just so we kind of are clear on all the things I just told you in that story, which was that time to hello world was subpar, support burden was high, developers asking for examples in different languages, the community building their own libraries. I don't think that's a bad thing, but it is a signal that they are really craving something. And I see it as not an either or, I see it as an and. If you want to do official SDKs and promote those community ones, I think that's a great strategy. And it's what we ended up doing at Zero once we got our own libraries in order. Those key accounts asking for SDKs, and our competition started to catch up to us in our DX. So what was that road like that I traveled? It was probably over 3 years long, and it started gradually. It started with me hand coding just a really basic library, and it was using XSD files to marshal and unmarshal XML. I hope I'm not speaking a strange language. Think serialize, deserialize with JSON. But it was XML, because that's what we had at the time. And we got that working. We got feedback. We put it on GitHub. It felt really good. And then we got a Swagger file we put together, and I said, okay, let's see if I can generate just the models. I'll just focus on the models. We've now support JSON. Let's get that integrated in. And then OAuth 2 came along. And I said, okay, this is it. I've kind of proven that this code generation stuff is starting to work. You know, it's 2018, 2019. And we say, let's do it. Let's go ahead and do 6 libraries in 6 different languages, and we'll add OAuth 2 support, and we'll do that. And we got there, but it took probably 18 months. And in the end, we only got 5 languages. I had some turnover on my team along the way, so it was a little touch and go whether we were going to have the expertise in-house, which is a real challenge when you do this in-house. And ultimately, we ended up contracting out the Python SDK just because we ran out of time and we had to get them done by, I think it was March 31st or something like that. So if I were to start today, where would I start? Because I did a 3-year journey, and it was very much sort of tiptoeing myself into the water. And so if I were to start today knowing what I know now, first thing is figure out the languages. So you can go talk to your developer community to find out what languages they want you to support. You can go to Stack Overflow. You can look at my chart here. This is those 100 API companies and what languages they support. I was impressed that 94% of them had some kind of JavaScript, Node support. And also, I thought it was really interesting that Go is nipping at the heels of C#. So But if you want to understand your developer community, go out and talk to them. And if you don't have time or it's difficult to go and talk to them, a nifty hack that I used at a company called Lob that I worked at, I had the BI team pull out all the unique user agent strings, and I was able to look through all the HTTP header client names and figure out which ones were Ruby, which ones were Java. There were lots of Java ones. And from that, I was able to kind of gauge our current community usage. We're clustering in these specific languages. So that way we could prioritize the SDKs that we were going to build for them. So what makes a good SDK? I think if you're going to start something like this, that's a good question. It's a question I've been asking myself this past year. And I think that SDKs need to be easy to use, and that's where you sort of hide that REST implementation, and you make it REST agnostic. You make it about the language that you're writing it in, whether it's Python or Java or .NET. You need to make it idiomatic, and I had to look that up this year because we were using it at the company, and I said, well, okay, let me make sure I know I'm clear on this. It's just the conventions and styles of the community, and it's important to remember that that's an evolving standard. It doesn't stay static. Languages are always growing and evolving. They should come with documentation that is specific to the SDK and specific to the language. And you might go, really, Sid, I got my great API reference docs. I don't need to do SDK docs. Well, if you do what I do, which is do what I did, which was just put the library out there, one of the first things, and I don't know whether it was the Node developers, but maybe they're quick. They came back and they were like, hey, this isn't acceptable. Where's my SDK documentation? I want to understand every method and every parameter. I want to be able to go and read it instead of having to fiddle around with your library. Also, those code samples. That's a real personal thing for me. I love the concept of copy, paste, run with code samples. I think that is a way that a lot of developers like to learn and explore and play around. I think that's kind of my style. Also, make sure that your SDKs has full coverage of your API, because developers who go to use your library, but you haven't gotten around to adding the latest endpoint, they're going to notice and they're going to let you know. And if the library is strongly typed, having that end-to-end typing is important, because that way you can catch compile time errors. Developers will get the code hinting, so they'll know it's a string or a date. And also make sure that they work. I think that's pretty obvious, but having some test coverage available for developers to have confidence that the library you've provided is well tested. It should be robust. Now we're getting more into the way beyond the API wrappers and into more advanced SDK development. Having a policy in place for timeouts, and it needs to be configurable. Again, I learned that from the Java community. They wanted that configuration to be able to do what they wanted with the library that we provided. Be able to do retries, some sort of transient errors, be able to surface meaningful errors that come back from the API through the SDK. And I mentioned those timely updates. That's not just updates to your API. If you've got other libraries that you're depending on, if there's security patches and vulnerabilities, you need to make sure you're able to address those quickly for your developer community. And then lastly, I mentioned my support team, and they were overwhelmed with inquiries. Make sure that your support team is up to date on your SDKs so that they can better support and answer not how do I authenticate, but how do I use your library to do X, which is when you really see the power of these, is when you're solving those kind of business problems for your community. So who's going to build your SDK program? Again, if I was starting today and I had a really generous budget, I would want to have someone who's like an architect, a program lead. I might need Ryan to come in. I need developers. I need content writers, your support team, of course. Maybe more developers. It depends on if the same people who create the SDKs are the same ones who are going to maintain them. They're going to stay up to date on language changes. And then I've been in developer relations for over a decade, so I see a lot of value in having someone who's engaged with the community, who's understanding what's working, what do the developers desire, and GitHub's a great way to do that. Now, the ways that you can build SDKs, there's what I would call homegrown or handwritten SDKs. There's open source code generators, which is what I used previously at Zero. And then there's this new crop of commercial code generators that are out there that will save you from having to hire as many people. And they often have a team of experts that can stay on top of those language changes. They have a holistic view. So there's some pros and cons to the different approaches. Again, pick which one's right for you. If you have very specific needs for your API and for your developer community, and handwriting your code libraries is the only way to do it, then go that route. But it is 2023. Code generation's gotten a lot better. Explore the other options if you can actually use those to generate your libraries, because when you change your API specification, your API definition, it's a miracle to see it update not just your libraries in multiple languages, but then also update the documentation, maybe update the code samples. It's really powerful. My favorite story is that I had a PHP developer identify a problem in our API definition, and I fixed it in the definition, and so the PHP developer was helping the Java and the Python and all the other developers without even realizing it. So quickly to recap, SDKs are more than code libraries. Reducing that boilerplate code complexity, helping developers achieve a state of flow is really the reason why developers want them. Not every API needs SDKs, so make sure you're looking at the signals for and against building them, because it is a big investment, and you don't want to build SDKs and then abandon them, because that's a terrible look, and your community won't love you for that. And establish what good means for you, your API, for your company, and for your community. And then use that criteria to evaluate the different ways that you can build SDKs. I have a comparison matrix here. It's really long, so I've cut it off, so I can't show it all to you on a slide. But I did collect all my thoughts from this presentation and all the thinking I've been doing this year into a little ebook that you can download. And what it has is also that comparison matrix. So all the criteria that I discussed earlier, you can take that and kind of shape it to your needs. And yeah, if you have questions and you want to talk about writing SDKs from scratch or generating them or marshalling and unmarshalling XML, hit me up. I'm happy to talk about any of that. Thanks again, and it's been great being here this week, and thank you, Travis, and I'll pass it over to you.